The room fell silent the moment the old man with the white baton pointed his finger directly at her. Not a polite, conversational silence. The kind of silence that happens when everyone in the room realizes something terrible and irreversible is about to occur. The kind that makes champagne glasses freeze halfway to lips and manicured hands grip clutch purses a little tighter. It was a Thursday evening in October 1990, and the Plaza Hotel in New York City was hosting its annual benefit gala for the American Classical Music Foundation. A black tie affair packed wall to wall with conductors, opera singers, music critics, and wealthy patrons who funded the kind of culture they liked to be seen near. Whitney Houston had been invited as the evening's special entertainment, which in the minds of nearly everyone in that gilded ballroom meant one thing. She would take the microphone, smile her famous smile, sing a couple of radio hits, collect her check, and leave so the serious people could get back to their serious conversations. What nobody had anticipated was Maestro Heinrich Brandt. If you're watching this channel for the first time and you love stories about legends who refuse to be put in a box, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happened next is one for the history books. Brandt was 72 years old that night, a German-born conductor who had led the Berlin Philharmonic for nearly 2 decades and who wore his contempt for popular music the way other men wore cologne: thick, pervasive, impossible to ignore in an enclosed space. He had won every award classical music had to offer, and over a long and distinguished career, he had developed a particular disdain for what he called amplified caterwauling, his term delivered with Teutonic precision for everything that had charted on American radio since roughly 1955. When Whitney was escorted to the table next to his, those seated nearby would later describe it as watching two weather systems collide. Whitney was 27, luminous in a floor-length ivory gown, gracious and warm in that effortless way she had, making everyone feel like the most interesting person in the room. Brandt sat 3 feet away with the expression of a man who had accidentally sat on a tack and was too dignified to acknowledge it. It was halfway through the second course when Brandt's assistant leaned over and whispered something in his ear. The maestro turned and looked at Whitney with the clinical interest of an entomologist discovering a new species of beetle. Then he spoke, loudly enough that the 8 people at their table and the 4 at the table behind could hear every syllable. "You are the singer they have brought for entertainment tonight," he said. Not a question, a categorization. Whitney looked up from her conversation and smiled. "That's me." Brandt considered this. "I am told you have a remarkable voice." "That's very kind." "I did not say it was kind. I said I was told." He took a precise sip of his wine. "I find that people who use their voices exclusively as instruments of commercial entertainment rarely understand what a voice is actually capable of. You are trained, yes? Conservatory? Classical study?" There was a beat. Whitney set down her fork with the kind of deliberate calm that people who've been underestimated their entire lives learn to deploy like a weapon. "I was trained at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey," she said. Brandt made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "A church singer," he said. "Yes, this explains much." He gestured toward the grand piano at the far end of the ballroom, polished to a mirror gleam. "You play, I assume. The piano?" "Some. Some." He repeated the word as if tasting something unpleasant. In the classical tradition, a singer who cannot play is not truly a musician. They are a performer, a vessel, the instrument of someone else's artistic vision. He smiled thinly. "You are, if I may speak plainly, a beautiful instrument through which other people's compositions pass. This is a fine thing to be, but do not confuse it with artistry." The table had gone very, very quiet. And this is the moment, right here, that you have to understand. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a register that somehow carried even further. "I have heard recordings of your performances. You have power, yes, extraordinary power. But power without architecture is merely noise. Screaming, if one wishes to be uncharitable." He paused. "I wish, on this occasion, to be uncharitable. What you do is not music, Miss Houston. It is spectacle." The woman to Whitney's left actually gasped. Somebody's water glass hit the tablecloth harder than intended. Whitney looked at Heinrich Brandt for a long, steady moment. Her expression had not changed. If anything, it had become quieter, more settled, like the surface of a lake right before something enormous rises from the bottom. "Would you excuse me for just one moment?" she said to the table at large. She stood, smoothed the front of her gown, and walked across that ballroom floor toward the grand piano. Every conversation in the room slowly, involuntarily, came to a halt. People turned. Champagne glasses hovered. The catering staff stopped moving. Even the string quartet in the corner lowered their instruments. The whole room held its breath as Whitney sat down at the piano bench, adjusted her position, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. What came out of that instrument was not what anyone had expected. It was Bach, specifically the prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier, a cascading waterfall of arpeggios demanding both technical precision and deep harmonic understanding. Whitney played it from memory, cleanly and expressively, with a musicality that made two of the professional pianists in the room exchange a glance that said, quite plainly, "Where did this come from?" But nobody had seen anything yet, because as the final notes of the Bach prelude faded into that stunned cathedral silence, Whitney did not stand up. She did not look back across the room at Brandt with any expression of satisfaction. Instead, she paused, hands resting lightly on the keys, head slightly bowed, and then began to play a single long, resonant chord in E-flat major. And she opened her mouth and started to sing. She sang "I Have Nothing." Not the radio version, not the polished Bodyguard soundtrack recording the world would hear a year later. This was something rawer and more terrifying and more alive. Her voice entered the room the way lightning enters a field. Sudden, absolute, filling every available space with light and heat and the undeniable authority of something that cannot be argued with. The first note alone was enough to make the hair stand up on the back of your neck. The kind of sound that bypasses the brain entirely and goes straight to something older. That place in you that recognizes, on a cellular level, that you are in the presence of something extraordinary. She built slowly, accompanying herself on piano, the harmonies rich and complex beneath a melody she bent and stretched and shaped with a mastery that made the architectural argument all by itself. This was not noise. This was not spectacle. This was a cathedral being constructed in real time, stone by stone, note by note, each phrase more perfectly placed than the last, the whole structure rising with an inevitability that made your chest tighten because you could feel what was coming. That moment, that note, the one that every Whitney Houston performance existed to deliver. When she hit it, 3 people in the front row stood up before they even realized they were standing. The note hung in the air above that ballroom like something visible, like something you could reach out and touch. And then it expanded, wider, higher, fuller, somehow both more powerful and more controlled with every passing second, her voice wrapping around it and opening it up the way a master jeweler cuts a stone to reveal the light trapped inside. It lasted longer than seemed physically possible. It lasted long enough for a woman in the back of the room to start crying quietly and not quite know why. It lasted long enough for Heinrich Brandt to set down his wineglass. When Whitney finally let the note resolve into its final chord, the silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then that room erupted. Standing ovation, immediate, unanimous, sustained. The kind of applause that isn't really about the performance anymore, but about something released in the people doing the clapping, some pressure or emotion that needed an outlet, and this was the only acceptable one. People were shouting. Grown men and women who had spent decades cultivating an air of cultural sophistication were on their feet, wiping their eyes, grabbing the arms of strangers next to them, helpless against what they just experienced. Whitney stood from the piano bench, smoothed her gown, that same unhurried, deliberate gesture, and walked back across the ballroom floor. She did not look triumphant. She did not look vindicated. She looked, if anything, a little tired in the way that people who have been proving themselves their entire lives sometimes look when it is finally, mercifully over. She reached her table. She sat down. She picked up her fork. Across from her, Heinrich Brandt was sitting very still. His expression was something you don't often see on the face of a man like that. Something genuinely new, something that hadn't been there an hour ago. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was larger than that. It was closer to revision, the complete and quiet dismantling of a certainty he had carried for 50 years, happening slowly and visibly behind his eyes. After a long moment, he cleared his throat. "Miss Houston," he said. Whitney looked up. "I was," the maestro said carefully, choosing each word the way he would choose a note in a score, with full knowledge of its weight. "Incorrect." She held his gaze for a beat. Then she nodded once and went back to her dinner. The story of that October evening at the Plaza has been passed down through the New York classical music world for more than 30 years. Those who were there describe it in the hushed language usually reserved for things that were witnessed rather than merely attended. Brandt never publicly addressed what happened, but those who worked alongside him noted that his contempt for popular music became considerably more selective. He was heard on at least 2 documented occasions, humming something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like it had come from a radio. Whitney Houston never mentioned that night in an interview. She didn't need to. But here is the truest thing about that evening, the thing that matters when you strip away the glamour and the drama. The cost of it, that is what always gets left out. We love the triumph, the standing ovation, the look on the maestro's face, but we move past too quickly the weight of having to prove yourself again and again to rooms that have already decided what you are before you open your mouth. Whitney spent her entire career carrying that weight. Every stage she walked onto, she carried the expectations of the record industry that had packaged her, the gospel community that had formed her, the critics who needed to categorize her, and the fans who required her to be superhuman. She carried all of it, every single night, for decades, and converted it, through a process that is ultimately mysterious, the way all great artistry is, into something that felt, in the moment of impact, like pure and effortless grace. But grace is never effortless. It only looks that way from the outside. What Brandt heard that night was 30 years of church pews and late-night vocal exercises, and a mother named Sissy Houston who did not permit shortcuts. It was Newark in her bones and God in her chest, and a lifetime of being told in 100 different ways that the space she was standing in wasn't quite built for someone like her. It was all of that. Every rejection, every genius turned sideways to fit through a door not designed for it, transmuted by a voice that was, there is simply no other word for it, a miracle. Not because it was powerful, though it was. Not because it was technically perfect, though it was that too. But because it was true. It told the truth about what it cost to be Whitney Houston so completely that even a man who had spent 72 years being certain about what music was found, himself sitting quietly in a gilded room with his certainties revised. That is what a voice can do when it belongs to someone who has paid the full price for it. That is what Whitney Houston did to every room she ever walked into.